Hello, and welcome back to Gravetalker Films. So, the other day I was able to see a double feature of the new horror films Weapons and Together at my local drive-in. Um, I'm sure as right now, neither of those need too much of an introduction. Weapons is the new film by Zach Kreger, the man behind Barbarian from a few years ago, and Together is a body horror film starring Dave Franco and Alison Brie, um, which I had seen trailers for throughout the year. But Weapons I went into completely blind, um, with the only knowledge being that it was the guy who was behind Barbarian. I will be honest, I saw Barbarian for the first time very recently, but I'd heard a lot of really good. Well, I don't know about really good. I had heard some really high highs and some really low lows from a variety of sources. But I finally watched it and I thought it was very good. Um, so to start off, I'll talk about Weapons first because me personally, I thought it was the better of the two films. Even though I liked both of them a great deal. Um, I think one of the first things that immediately stuck out to me was again I had gone into this completely blind without really even knowing the premise. Um, so all I had going in was the knowledge of the director. But the first thing that stuck out to me is that I've well I've seen a handful of new films with non-linear storytelling, which I find is a very unique storytelling mechanic when it's done correctly. Famously in Pulp Fiction, and then in a lot of Christopher Nolan films, it's done very well. But I can also find doing the non-linear thing every once in a while can get a little artsy for the sake of it, which I have no problem with artsy films, but there are times when it works better than others. But I found that in Weapons, it made the once I kind of realized where it was going, once I realized that it was non-linear, but kind of the way that the story's laid out, by the end of it, I found that that the nonlinear approach was probably the best way to introduce all of the characters sequentially and all of the plot lines sequentially, so that once you get to the climax, um, there was like everything had its proper build up, and so I was impressed with the way that they called back to things earlier in the film, but it never felt like it was a very cyclical process where every time it would cut to a new character, there was something new being developed that would be paid off later on. Now I did see this for the first time on a drive-in screen, so there are times when films that are very dark are sometimes hard to see what's going on. But I found that the way that the film was shot was very impressive, and even when there's scenes set in like pitch dark houses with no lights on and with like very faint moonlight in the windows, I still found that there was a crispness to the way that it was shot that allowed everything to be very visible, and you never felt, or at least I never felt like I was struggling to see what was happening on camera, which again that is kind of that's like the only negative I can say about the drive-in experience. But every once in a while I'll see a film where I can't really tell what's going on, but even on a drive-in screen, it was a good projection system, but I could still tell what was going on. And just in general, it was shot really nicely. There was great uses of natural lighting. The opening sequence when you have all the kids running out of the houses. There was the way they used the street lamps and kind of the warm lighting of the street lamps. I found was really impressive and really visually exciting. Um, so on a visual and on a technical front, I thought that the film was pretty outstanding. There was, I guess, aspects of Barbarian that I thought it was a great film, but it felt a little bit low budget in areas, which is not a bad thing at all. But you could feel a little bit of the budget there. But I feel like in Weapons, it felt very big. It felt very large budget and large scale, and I feel like with the budget that they had, it was very impressive what they were able to do. It didn't feel like it had a small budget. It didn't feel like there was restraints. It felt large and there was a lot going on, and it was executed really well. Um, and I thought that on a character front, I don't necessarily know if it has some of the most memorable characters of all time, but all of the characters were very interesting. You have, of course, Josh Brolin and the lady who played Silver Surfer in here. And I thought they were very good leads. You have Wong from the MCU, as well as the guy who played young Han in Solo from several years ago, as supporting characters, and I thought that the cast was a really good cast. There were good characters, well written. I will say there were some moments where some of the characters did some questionable things. Like if there's no caller ID on a phone call, why would you respond to something like that? That feels a little unrealistic. But for the most part, I felt like the characters were pretty relatable and not incredibly stupid to the point that you don't like them. Myself having two teachers as parents and growing up around teachers and people who are involved in schools, I thought there was something very interesting about the character of a teacher who has been blamed and is kind of taking the heat when it's kind of obvious that she doesn't really know what's going on, but she's taking all the heat for the kid's disappearance. I thought there was something interesting about that. Given modern politics, teachers are getting blamed for things that it really makes no sense for teachers get blamed for, but there was something interesting about that in the story. And once again, there's an aspect of I always like stories of characters who for pretty understandable reasons don't like each other, and then they end up forming an alliance over a shared experience or whatever. And I think that it's not a huge part of the film, but going into the third act, I thought that was a nice, satisfying moment right after the big chase scene at the gas station. And what I will say about, to get a little bit into spoilers, if you don't want to know anything about the premise, that I thought that I guess I figured it was going to be a little bit more sci-fi than supernatural by the end of it, but there was an eventual supernatural twist that I thought was handled pretty well. It didn't feel too abrupt to the point that it switched genres. My closest comparison is Long Legs from last year, which I really enjoyed. I thought it was a really, really well made thriller, but I did find that you had 2/3 of the film that are very grounded and realistic in its approach, but then you have the third act when it suddenly becomes like all this crazy stuff about possessed dolls and these dolls infecting people's minds. It was interesting concept. I felt that the tonal shift was a little bit too abrupt, or it's not even a tonal shift. It was more of a shift in the genre that was a bit abrupt. But I thought that in Weapons, the eventual supernatural twist it didn't change too much. It felt earned, and then it's not egregious in the way that it's handled. It's not explained too much, but it's also not over explained, and there's just the right amount of intrigue surrounding it that made it effective for me on my first watch. And what I will say about the film is that this is what I personally want from modern horror films. It wears its influences on its sleeves. It's certainly not the most original concept that's ever been done. I feel like Barbarian was a pretty original concept, but there's nothing wrong with taking influence from other things and other ideas, but putting your own spin on it. And when you have a film that's even though it was well over 2 hours, I thought it was pretty tight. The pacing wasn't abysmal for me. It didn't drag too much. Around the middle it was a little slow, but it was paced pretty well. But I find that when you execute something well, then that's all I can really ask for, and I feel like this is what horror in cinema needs now. And Zach Kreger is certainly making a name for himself as a horror director. I'm excited to see what he does next, because he's done two really good horror films in the past 3 or 4 years. So I think certainly one of the year's best in the horror genre, and would probably be around my best of the year. I really enjoyed it. So the second film in the lineup was Together, directed by Michael Shanks, who I had never heard of up until this point. From what I read, this is his first major film, and I had actually seen trailers for it earlier in the year, and I saw a bit more of the premise and understood kind of what it was. And I don't want to start off with my negatives, but I feel like I'll get the big one out of the way first. Is that I thought I knew what this film was going to be. I knew it was going to be a body horror film, which I don't have a whole lot of experience with the body horror subgenre, but I thought I had an idea of what it was going to be, of a couple who's kind of drifted apart, and is struggling to find a spark in their relationship, and they're alone in this cabin for whatever reason, and then they suddenly start to literally fuse together in various ways. I thought that was a very interesting concept, and while the film certainly does take that premise seriously, and I think does it justice, there was a little bit of extra added stuff in there. There was, and I need to get into spoilers a little bit. There's the whole cult. There's the whole cult side plot, which I felt like kind of explained the whole inciting incident, but for me, I don't think I needed that to make sense of the whole thing. But I also don't feel like it was explained enough. I feel like they could have gone further with exploring the cult side plot. I feel like once they do stuff with it, then they just kind of forget about it in the third act, and then it's not really followed up on, which was my biggest problem with the film. But as for the positives, the effects were really good, and it was really gnarly. The scene in particular when they're in the stall made me cringe pretty hard, and that doesn't happen a whole lot with horror movies for me. But I was certainly squirming around in my chair when they're in the bathroom stall. That was pretty effective. I think your two lead performances in particular were very good. Dave Franco and Alison Brie they're a couple in real life, and I've heard about real life couples tending to not have great on-screen chemistry. There's been a few recent examples to dispute that, but I find that this is another example to dispute, because I think they have very good chemistry and they're very believable as a couple, and for better or worse, believable as a couple who has lost a lot of the intensity of their relationship with each other. I thought they made for two very compelling leads. There were certain aspects of the dialogue in the beginning that felt a little clunky, though I am willing to bet that there was a little bit of intentionality with that, being that they are a little, they are just trying to play along, and they don't really mean what they're saying, and so I can excuse the clunky dialogue there, because it was meant to be awkward in the beginning, and I think they succeed at making it feel a little bit awkward. You don't have a whole lot of supporting performances. It's primarily focused on those two, but the acting was good, and then I also feel like on a technical level it was well done. There, as compared to Weapons, it wasn't. I don't know if it was as, I don't want to say experimental, but if there was as much focus put on the cinematography and the look of the film, but it was well put together on a visual front. I have heard some varying reactions to the ending of the film, which, given the image that the film leaves off on, I can see why some people would have their feathers ruffled by it, which I think that's silly, but it's ballsy, and I think that's what we need in modern horror. Is one of the biggest things we need is people willing to go there and do ballsy things that might alienate people for dumb reasons, even if it's for dumb reasons. But I do think the ending was effective, and the ending was certainly not what I expected, but didn't feel. But once you got there, it felt earned, and it kind of highlights there is a kind of a unsettling to me the most unsettling aspect of the film was, by the end of the film you had two characters who were shown who were one body with two people living inside them. That's spoilers. But that was, the more I think about that, the more that kind of gets under my skin, because even if it's even if it's a consensual, there's still kind of a creepy aspect of two people living within one body. That was kind of tied into the whole cult thing, which, if they were going to go in the cult direction, I wish was explained a little bit further. But I did think that was effective. I don't think I liked it as much as Weapons, but I still really enjoyed it, and there was a lot, and there was a lot to like about it. So all in all, this has kind of been a weird hybrid 2-in-1 review. But what I will say about this is that I've not seen a ton of new release films this year, not as much as other people on the internet have, and I realize there's been some pretty unpopular horror films to come out this year, but I think between these two films, Companion and Sinners, I think this has been a pretty okay year for horror. There's been some less than stellar ones, but with those four, I think we have some pretty good lineup of films to remember. And I'm just, maybe it's unwarranted, but I do hope that that people are seeing what new up and coming directors are capable of doing in this genre, especially because there's been some good work done, and I was very happy to be able to see these at a drive-in. Me personally, I feel like there's no better place to see horror films, whether they're new or old, than at a drive-in. But you don't have to see them at a drive-in. I would recommend, but if you like horror films, I would recommend seeing either or both of these. I think it was time well spent, and certainly an argument to the quality of new horror films. So, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, and if you're interested in seeing more of my thoughts on other films I've seen throughout the year, please follow my Letterboxd at Haddonfield Mech. All of these links posted up here, as well as in the description below. So, I'll see you next time. Keep on walking.